She gave her daughter the last name of the man who denied her at birth. 8 years later, that little girl walked into his boardroom, looked him dead in the eye, and shattered his entire legacy with one sentence. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Claire Mitchell wiped down the last counter at Miller's Diner the same way she had for the past 4 years, brisk, methodical, invisible. Outside, the sky over Maple Grove was still half asleep, a sleepy Kentucky town where nothing much ever changed, especially not for women like Claire. She moved with quiet precision apron, slightly frayed name tag, tilted as her daughter Sophie sat curled in the corner booth with a dog-eared German workbook legs swinging off the seat lips, murmuring foreign verbs like a second heartbeat. Claire had taught her that language was a bridge, not a barrier, even if no one had ever built one for them. That morning, a man in a pressed navy suit forgot his phone on the counter. Moments later, it rang, and Sophie answered first in English, then effortlessly in German. Claire turned around just in time to see the man return frozen in the doorway, eyes wide with recognition. Something shifted. A spark. The kind that doesn't belong in diners at dawn, especially not for women like her. But it had already begun. Claire Mitchell didn't plan on raising a child alone, but life in Maple Grove, Kentucky had a way of cornering women like her, quiet women with good grammar and worn-out shoes. At 33, she moved like someone who knew how to disappear into a crowd without ever trying. Every morning before sunrise, she slipped into her faded green uniform and walked 3 blocks to Miller's Diner, the only place in town that opened before the school buses rolled out. Claire wasn't bitter, just tired, a kind of deep, unshakable exhaustion that had less to do with lack of sleep and more to do with carrying everything by herself. Her dark blonde hair was always tied up in the same practical knot, her face scrubbed clean, her voice measured and polite. Maple Grove was the kind of town where everyone knew your past and reminded you of it with every sideways glance. Claire had long stopped caring. She had Sophie now, her 8-year-old daughter with eyes too old for her age and a mind that moved like wind through trees. People whispered about Claire when they thought she wasn't listening, that she had no ring, no degree, no man. But what they never saw was the way she studied German late at night with her daughter, the way she folded each napkin with dignity, or how, despite it all, she never stopped showing up. The morning rush hadn't started yet, but Claire Mitchell was already moving like it had. At 6:03 a.m., the coffee machine hissed with impatience as she poured the first dark roast of the day, wiped down the counter with one hand, and balanced a tray of clean mugs with the other. The smell of bacon and burnt toast clung to her uniform like memory. Miller's Diner wasn't glamorous, but it was steady linoleum floors, metal stools that creaked when the regulars leaned in, and a jukebox that hadn't played anything new since 1997. Claire greeted each early customer with a polite smile, and the same question she always asked: cream and sugar or just black today. She moved between booths and counters like choreography, her eyes constantly scanning for spills, half-empty cups, or anyone looking too lost to ask for help. In the corner booth, Sophie was already up and reading, her little fingers tracing lines of foreign text in a children's German workbook. Claire stole glances at her between tables, making sure her daughter had enough milk in her cup and a clean napkin tucked under her elbow. This was their rhythm. Claire working, Sophie studying, 2 halves of a quiet survival story they never spoke out loud. Sophie Mitchell sat curled in the corner booth like she'd been there all her life, back straight, legs dangling just above the floor, a pencil tucked behind her ear and a workbook open in front of her. She wasn't fidgety like most 8-year-olds. She didn't swing her feet to make noise or whine for pancakes. Instead, she worked in silence, lips occasionally moving as she sounded out German vocabulary words under her breath, her voice soft and precise. Her backpack, an old canvas thing patched at the seams, was filled not with toys, but with flashcards, dog-eared paperbacks, and a tiny pocket dictionary her mother had found at a second-hand shop. The other waitresses often said Sophie was wise beyond her years, but Claire knew better. Her daughter wasn't wise, she was watchful, careful, the kind of child who learned early how not to take up too much space, who never interrupted, who always cleared her table without being asked. She greeted every adult with sir or ma'am, eyes, steady voice, gentle as if she were apologizing for being young. No one taught her that, not directly. It was something she absorbed, just like the languages, just like the silence Claire wrapped around her like armor. It happened just after 6:45 a.m., when the diner was beginning to hum with the sounds of clinking cups and muffled greetings. A man in a tailored navy suit had come in, briefly ordered a black coffee to go paid with a crisp bill, and left without touching his phone, which now sat silent and forgotten near the edge of the counter. Claire didn't notice right away she was busy refilling creamers and taking 2 orders at once, but Sophie did. She watched the phone with mild curiosity until it buzzed, vibrated once, then rang. The sound was sharp and out of place in the quiet corner of the diner, making a few patrons glance up. Sophie hesitated only a moment before sliding out of her booth and picking it up carefully. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but polite. A pause. Then, with startling ease, she switched into German, answering the caller with full, fluid sentences, nodding as if she could be seen, her small voice carrying the cadence of someone far older. Claire froze mid-step, coffee pot in hand, and turned just in time to hear her daughter say something about a business meeting being rescheduled and the file being forwarded. It wasn't just the language, it was the confidence, the fluency, the grace of it. By the time she hung up, half the diner had gone silent. The man on the other end of the call paused for a beat too long after Sophie's final sentence, as if trying to match the voice he'd just heard to the professional translator he must have assumed he'd reached. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but laced with confusion. "Who am I speaking with?" Sophie politely responded, still in German, that she was just helping return a lost phone and that her mother worked at the diner. There was another pause, followed by a crisp request. "Can I speak with your manager?" Sophie blinked, glanced toward the counter, then quietly handed the phone to Claire, who had now made her way over, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. She took the phone cautiously, unsure what conversation she was stepping into. "This is Claire Mitchell," she said, voice low but firm. On the other end, the man smoothly switched to English. "Miss Mitchell," he said. "Who was that speaking just now?" Claire's chest tightened. "My daughter," she replied. A silence followed, dense, assessing. "Then I'm turning around. I'll be there in 5 minutes." The line clicked. Claire stared at the phone, heart pounding, unaware that everything in her life had just quietly shifted course. Exactly 4 minutes and 52 seconds later, the man in the navy suit stepped back into the diner, this time without the rush of someone grabbing coffee on the go. Claire noticed him instantly, not just because of the tailored cut of his jacket or the polished leather shoes that didn't belong on a linoleum floor, but because of the way he scanned the room with quiet intent. His eyes landed on Sophie first, then on Claire, and he walked toward them with the calm certainty of someone used to entering rooms where decisions were made. "Claire Mitchell," he asked, his voice calm, warm, and curious rather than accusatory. She nodded slowly, unsure whether to brace herself or offer him a refill. "I'm Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter & Rowe Global." The name hit her like cold water. She'd read about the company, multinational, highly competitive, nowhere near the orbit of a sleepy town like Maple Grove. Before she could ask what he was doing here, he gestured to the phone she still held. "My assistant just informed me that someone, your daughter, I believe, took my call and handled it better than half my staff could have." His gaze was measured but not unkind. "How old is she?" Claire swallowed hard. 8. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was watching him carefully, then back at Claire. "I think we need to talk." Daniel Carter returned the very next morning, not with a briefcase or a security team, but with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate and a question waiting behind his polite smile. Claire had just started her shift when she saw him through the diner window. Same clean-cut suit, same calm stride, but this time with something softer in his expression. He walked in like a man who knew this wasn't his world but didn't mind being a guest. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted, handing her the drink with a quiet confidence that felt more personal than professional. "And one for the young translator," he added, nodding towards Sophie, who had just slid into the same booth by the window, a new workbook already open beside her oatmeal. Claire hesitated, glancing from the cup to his face, unsure what he expected. "I just wanted to thank you both properly," Daniel said. "I've had dozens of assistants handle international calls, and none could have responded the way she did yesterday." Sophie looked up, startled but proud. "How long has she been learning German?" he asked, genuinely curious. Claire replied, Since she was 5. Spanish and French, too? Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. Well, he said slowly, I think we should have a longer conversation if you're open to it. Daniel sat across from Claire and Sophie at the booth, his hands resting lightly around the untouched cup of coffee he had just ordered, more out of courtesy than need. His eyes, however, stayed focused on the little girl scribbling quietly in a workbook that looked far too advanced for someone her age. She was switching between German and English so naturally he said almost to himself. And when I asked her a question about scheduling, she didn't just respond, she translated the intent, not just the words. Claire offered a small nod but said nothing. Compliments made her wary. They often came with strings. But Daniel wasn't just being polite, he looked genuinely fascinated. Most adults panic when asked to speak a second language on the spot, even trained ones, he continued. But your daughter, what's her name again? Sophie Claire answered. Sophie, he repeated thoughtfully, turning toward her. Has anyone ever tested her, formally? For giftedness? Linguistic aptitude? Claire shook her head. We can't afford private testing. I just teach her what I know, and she takes it from there. Daniel leaned back slightly, a mix of admiration and disbelief crossing his face. Well, Miss Mitchell, he said, after a pause, Sophie may be the most remarkable person I've met this year, and I've just come from Zurich. Daniel sipped his coffee slowly, studying Claire over the rim of his cup, with the quiet focus of someone piecing together a puzzle. You said you teach her, he began carefully. Does that mean you have a background in linguistics? Translation? Maybe you used to work in education? Claire looked down at her hands, fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her apron. She gave a polite smile, the kind worn by people who've learned to keep their past folded neatly out of sight. Nothing formal, she said lightly. Just books, tapes, the internet. Sophie picks things up quickly and I do my best to keep up. Daniel tilted his head, unconvinced. You seem far too precise to have no formal training. Your daughter didn't just mimic German, she understood nuanced tone. That's something taught, or inherited. Claire's smile didn't falter, but a thin shadow passed through her eyes. We get by, she said simply, as if that closed the door to further inquiry. He sensed the wall respected it, but didn't forget it. There was more to her, that much was clear, not just in the way she spoke, but in what she chose not to say. Whatever life she'd left behind, it hadn't been ordinary. And he knew better than to press too soon. Daniel leaned forward, setting his coffee aside as his tone shifted from curious to deliberate. Miss Mitchell, he said, keeping his voice low enough not to draw attention, I know this may sound unconventional, but I'd like to offer you a temporary position. Contract-based flexible hours. Nothing binding. Claire blinked, unsure whether she'd heard correctly. He continued. At Carter & Rowe, we've recently expanded into several multilingual markets. We're hemorrhaging time and money trying to coordinate communications between departments, vendors, and clients across languages. What your daughter demonstrated yesterday, it's rare, but what caught my attention even more was your guidance behind it. That kind of foundational structure doesn't happen by accident. Claire's instinct was to say no. No to attention, no to uncertainty, no to whatever this was that felt too good to be safe. It would be remote. Mostly, Daniel added, sensing her hesitation. Initial onboarding would be in person, but after that, just support translating internal documents, interpreting quick conversations, helping us flag mistakes in our localized material. We'll compensate you well. Claire stared at the sugar packets on the table, calculating not just logistics, but consequences. Still, a flicker passed through her. It wasn't ambition. It was something older, like the memory of a door that had once slammed shut, and now unexpectedly cracked open again. Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes dropped to Sophie, who was now quietly organizing her flashcards, unaware of the weight suddenly hanging in the air above her mother's head. I appreciate the offer. Mr. Carter. Claire began slowly, her voice careful, like someone walking barefoot across broken glass. But I'm not sure I'm the right fit for something like that. Daniel didn't press, only nodded with the patience of a man who understood that the most meaningful yeses often needed room to breathe. Claire wasn't worried about the workload or even the pressure. What unsettled her was what this opportunity might awaken questions about her past, her education, where she had disappeared to for 8 years, and why someone with her skill set was wiping counters in a roadside diner. She had built a life designed to avoid being found, a life small enough to protect Sophie from the shadows she herself hadn't fully escaped. But later that evening, long after the tables were cleared and the sign flipped to closed, she sat with Sophie under the kitchen's dim light and asked if I worked somewhere new, somewhere different. Would you be okay with that? Sophie, without looking up from her workbook, said, "As long as you still come home." And with that, Claire made the quiet, trembling decision to say yes. Claire Mitchell stepped through the glass doors of Carter & Row with the kind of quiet apprehension that clung to the back of her neck like humidity in late September. The lobby was vast, clinical, and humming with the kind of energy that only existed in places where people wore ambition, like tailored suits. She clutched her borrowed laptop bag, secondhand scrubbed clean but still frayed at the corners, and tried to steady her breathing as the receptionist greeted her with a smile that was too bright to be real. This was a different world, polished and fast, with walls that gleamed and elevators that whispered open without effort. Claire felt like an imposter, a waitress pretending to be someone important. She kept her head down as she moved past glass-walled conference rooms and sleek digital displays that flashed languages she recognized instantly: French, German, Mandarin. A part of her wanted to run to turn back toward the safe noise of clattering dishes and coffee orders, but another part, the quieter, buried part, kept her walking forward. She remembered Sophie's words, "As long as you come home." So she kept her back straight, nodded politely, and stepped into the unknown, carrying nothing but her talent and a past she hoped wouldn't follow. As Claire entered the third-floor workspace where the localization and language services team operated, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Sleek desks arranged in perfect rows, muted phone conversations in multiple languages, and the ever-present tapping of rapid-fire typing formed the new rhythm she was expected to absorb. She followed a junior associate to the desk they had set up for her, temporary, modest, but neatly prepared. Still, it wasn't the furniture that made her shoulders stiffen. It was the subtle glances. 2 women seated across the aisle leaned in, just slightly whispering behind their coffee mugs. Claire caught fragments. "Is that her and from the diner, right?" And then a quiet snort. She served pancakes now, she's reviewing Mandarin grammar. Someone muttered just loud enough to pierce the air like a needle. Claire pretended not to hear, but the heat rising to her face betrayed her. She sat down, took a slow breath, and opened the project file Daniel had emailed the night before. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them doubt. They hadn't heard Sophie speak fluent German over a half-empty cup of milk, or watched a child turn vocabulary into music. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here for a reason that none of them would ever understand. Amanda Blake walked into the room with the kind of crisp authority that made junior staff sit up straighter and conversations die mid-sentence. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, every step a declaration that she belonged and that she was watching. Mid-30s, perfectly pressed blouse, not a hair out of place, Amanda had worked her way through Ivy League programs and multilingual internships to land this position as a mid-level supervisor at Carter & Row. She didn't like surprises, and Claire Mitchell was most certainly a surprise. As Amanda approached Claire's desk, her eyes flicked once to the worn edges of Claire's bag, then to the plain shoes, then to the file open on her screen. Her smile was tight, controlled, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Miss Mitchell," she said, voice flat, "I assume you've been briefed on our formatting expectations." Claire nodded quietly. Amanda's gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, scanning as if waiting for Claire to falter. "We run a precision-based department here." She added, her tone laced with something almost condescending. "Let me know if anything is too advanced." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned sharply and walked away, leaving behind the unmistakable scent of dismissal, not outright, but measured, intentional, and razor-thin. Later that afternoon, after the murmurs had died down and Claire had spent 3 silent hours navigating the unfamiliar software dashboard, Daniel Carter appeared beside her desk with none of the ceremony his title typically demanded. He wasn't followed by assistants or trailed by Buzz. He simply showed up with a quiet presence and a tablet in hand. "You holding up okay?" He asked, his voice low enough that it didn't carry. Claire nodded, though her eyes betrayed a mix of exhaustion and guarded resolve. Daniel didn't press. Instead, he pulled up a chair beside her and slid the tablet across. "Here's something simple to start, just a marketing draft we're localizing for our Berlin team. The German's technically accurate, but it lacks tone. I want it to sound like someone speaking, not translating." Claire leaned forward, scanning the lines, her brow furrowing slightly as she murmured corrections under her breath. Daniel watched, not impatiently but attentively, until she looked up. "You know," she said quietly, "they'll resent this." "Resent me?" Daniel's gaze softened, but he didn't offer pity. "Then let the work speak," he said. "They don't need to like you, Claire. They just need to see you're the best person for the job." At precisely 5:02 p.m., as the office lights dimmed to signal the end of the workday, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Sophie Mitchell stepped out clutching a paperback novel in one hand and her mother's spare scarf in the other. She walked through the sleek corridors of Carter and Row with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, even if she was only 8 years old and barely reached the height of the reception desk. A few employees looked up from their monitors, expecting a lost intern's child or perhaps a courier's mistake. But what they saw instead was a little girl with observant eyes and a posture that belonged in a diplomatic meeting. Sophie approached Claire's desk, calmly nodded a polite "Good evening" to the two interns whispering nearby, and waited with her hands folded as her mother wrapped up a final note in the translation log. Amanda Blake passed by at that moment, and her eyes narrowed slightly, catching the brief, uncanny resemblance between Claire's stillness and Sophie's poise. Daniel Carter, a few feet away in conversation, turned just long enough to smile. "That your daughter?" one junior associate whispered, stunned. "She doesn't talk like a kid." No, Sophie didn't talk like a kid. She listened like a scholar and walked like someone born of grace under pressure. That evening, the apartment above the laundromat buzzed softly with the sounds of evening routine, the kettle hissing on the stove, the faint hum of laundry machines below, and the rustle of pages turning as Claire and Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, their translation notebooks spread between them like a shared secret. The room was small, cluttered with the warmth of two lives, carefully stacked together books in uneven towers, thrifted furniture patched with love, and Sophie's drawings taped proudly along the wall. A worn desk sat unused in the corner because they preferred to work side by side on the rug, a tradition born more from closeness than necessity. Claire pointed to a line in a product description drafted in French, murmuring the sentence aloud before Sophie softly offered her version in English. "Good," Claire whispered, marking the section with a star. "Now what would it sound like if we made it warmer?" Sophie paused, thinking, then smiled and rewrote the line with a gentler tone. They continued like that for hours, laughing quietly when one of them chose an awkward phrase, leaning in when a difficult sentence needed solving. There was no competition, no condescension, only a steady rhythm of shared intellect, respect, and love flowing between them in two languages. They were in the break room late one evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, the hum of the vending machine, the only sound between them. Claire was rinsing out her thermos when Daniel, leaning against the far counter with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, spoke in a tone that was careful, almost too careful. "If it's not too personal," he began, his voice gentler than usual, "may I ask why Sophie doesn't have her father's last name?" The question hung in the air like fog, soft but impossible to ignore. Claire didn't flinch, but her hands slowed under the water. She dried them meticulously before turning around, her expression unreadable. "Because he didn't ask to be a father," she said simply. Daniel's eyes met hers, and he didn't speak, allowing her the space to continue or not. He was brilliant, charming, fluent in 3 languages. "And terrified," she added almost as an afterthought. "When I told him I was pregnant, he asked if I was sure it was his. Then he disappeared." She shrugged, but the gesture was tight. "I gave Sophie my name because I was the one who stayed, because she deserved a name tied to someone who chose her." Daniel nodded slowly, quietly moved. He didn't apologize. He didn't pity. He simply said, "She carries it well." Claire didn't often allow herself to go back to that winter when the nights felt longer than the days, and every hour seemed to press in on her like a question with no answer. She had been 24, bright-eyed and naive enough to believe that love alone could hold up the sky. Gregory Shaw had been everything she thought she wanted: articulate, magnetic, with a passport full of stamps and a tongue fluent in promise. They had met at a conference on linguistic preservation, and for a few months it felt like something extraordinary, until the word pregnant turned their story into something else entirely. She could still see his face when she told him, first frozen, then cautious, and finally cold. "Are you sure it's mine?" He'd asked, the words slashing through the warmth they had built like glass. The look in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was exit strategy. He said he needed time, then stopped returning her calls. Within 2 weeks, his number was disconnected, and the apartment he'd rented in Chicago was empty. No note, no forwarding address, just silence. And in that silence, Claire learned something permanent. Some men were fluent in many languages, but none in accountability. So she chose to raise Sophie in the one language that never failed presence. Claire remembered the day with a clarity that hurt, sitting alone in the fluorescent-lit office of the county records department, swollen with exhaustion and still aching from the birth, the air tinged with the sterile scent of paper and ink. The woman behind the counter had asked the standard questions, with mechanical politeness, her fingers tapping across the keyboard. Father's name, she had asked, without looking up. Claire had hesitated, her heart thudding in her ears. She could have said it, Gregory Shaw, but the name caught in her throat like a splinter. What right did he have to be etched into Sophie's first official document when he had walked away before she'd even drawn her first breath? So she met the clerk's eyes and said, "There's no father on the record." The woman nodded without surprise, adjusted the form, and moved on. Child's surname. Claire didn't hesitate this time. "Mitchell," she said firmly. "Sophie Mitchell." She watched as the letters appeared on the screen, bold and definitive. It wasn't just a name, it was a choice, a promise. Sophie would not grow up feeling tethered to someone who had abandoned her. She would carry the name of someone who loved her enough to stay. Always. Claire's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years she had never spoken aloud. She stood by the break room window, her arms crossed loosely as she stared out at the city lights, so distant, so indifferent. Daniel had asked gently without judgment why she had chosen not to give Sophie her father's last name, but now she turned to face him fully, her eyes clear and resolute. "I didn't name her after someone who erased her," she said, each word deliberate. "I don't believe in honoring absence." Daniel didn't respond, sensing that what was coming next was not for argument or consolation, but for truth. Claire continued, her voice low but sharp with emotion long buried. "When I told Gregory I was pregnant, he didn't get angry. He got quiet, cold. He said he needed time to think, like our child was a hypothetical to be debated. And then he disappeared, blocked my number, switched cities. That wasn't just rejection, that was erasure. So when the nurse handed me the birth certificate form, I made a decision." She paused, her jaw tightening slightly. "I wasn't going to brand my daughter with the name of a man who had already tried to pretend she didn't exist." She looked back out the window. "You don't name a child after someone who chose silence." Daniel said nothing. He didn't offer a sympathetic nod or a well-meaning platitude. He simply stood beside Claire, his posture composed, but still the silence between them deep and intentional. There was a gravity in her words he understood instinctively, not as a man who had lived her experience, but as someone wise enough to know when to speak and when to listen. His respect wasn't performative. It was woven into the way he didn't try to fix what she hadn't asked to be fixed. He didn't ask follow-up questions or try to make sense of her pain. He just stayed. And in that quiet, unbroken moment, Claire felt something unexpected. Not closure, not relief, but recognition. The memo came through internal email late Tuesday evening, subject line, "Final list, Berlin Conference Prep Team." Claire opened it expecting the usual logistics and translation briefs, but her name wasn't on the list. She read it twice to be sure, to be Not only was she excluded, but several junior associates, some with half her linguistic range, had been selected. Claire kept her reaction measured, but inside something twisted. The next morning, she approached Amanda Blake's office, knocked lightly, and waited. Amanda looked up from her screen with a thin, businesslike smile. "Yes," Claire cleared her throat. "I noticed I wasn't included on the Berlin prep list. I've done the last 3 rounds of translations for the German branch, and I'm fluent in." Amanda raised a hand, already disinterested. "Claire, this isn't about language. It's about alignment with executive-level expectations. The team for Berlin requires deep familiarity with corporate structure, global regulatory nuance, and high-pressure diplomacy." Her words were crisp, rehearsed. "You're still transitioning from a different professional background. This meeting isn't the right fit yet." Claire stood there, absorbing the coded dismissal wrapped in professional courtesy. She recognized it for what it was: not an honest assessment, but a gate kept deliberately shut. Amanda didn't see Claire as competition. She saw her as a threat dressed in humility, and threats needed to be sidelined early. Later that afternoon, after the meeting schedule was finalized and Amanda had made her quiet power play clear, Daniel found Claire reviewing a stack of internal memos in the far corner of the office. He didn't mention the Berlin prep team or Amanda's decision directly. Instead, he slid a thin folder onto her desk. No smile, no small talk, just quiet intention. 3 documents, he said evenly. 1 internal operations brief, 1 vendor agreement, and 1 press release, each in a different language: French, German, and Mandarin. Translate them, contextualize for tone, and note any cultural inconsistencies you'd flag before publishing. Claire looked at the folder, then at him. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. 48 hours, Daniel replied. No extensions. His tone was not demanding, but deliberate, challenging without aggression. She opened the folder, scanned the headers, and nodded once. No protests, no excuses. Just that steady, grounded presence that had drawn his attention from the beginning. He didn't say it outright, but the offer was clear: prove them wrong, not through argument or confrontation, but through excellence. If Amanda had shut the door, Daniel had quietly unlocked a window. Claire didn't thank him. She just got to work because that was how she had survived her whole life, by letting her effort speak before her name ever did. That night, the small apartment above the laundromat glowed with the faint hum of determination. Claire sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by open dictionaries, grammar guides, and half-filled mugs of lukewarm tea. Her laptop screen glared at her with a quiet intensity, the cursor blinking beside phrases that demanded perfection. She hadn't pulled an all-nighter since college, before Sophie, before Gregory, before everything had unraveled, but tonight wasn't about nostalgia. It was about proving that she belonged in a room that had been built to keep people like her out. Across the table, Sophie sat cross-legged in her pajamas, her face lit by the soft yellow lamp, flipping through her well-worn German dictionary. "Mama," she said, not even looking up. "I think Rücksichtnahme fits better than Achtung here. It sounds more empathetic." Claire smiled despite herself, replaced the word, and kept typing. For hours they worked in tandem, Sophie, checking tone, catching tiny typos, and translating phrases aloud like she was humming a lullaby. Claire had never asked her for help, but Sophie had shown up anyway, as she always did. By 4 a.m., 1 document was finished, the second halfway done, and Claire's hands trembled from fatigue but not from fear, because this wasn't just a test of skill, it was a battle for space, and they were in it together. The apartment was silent except for the soft clicks of the keyboard and the gentle rustling of pages turning. Outside, Maple Grove slept beneath a blanket of stars, unaware that a mother and daughter were waging a quiet battle with language and time. Claire and Sophie sat across from each other, not speaking but communicating in a rhythm more precise than words. When Claire paused, eyes squinting at a particularly dense Mandarin phrase, Sophie slid a note across the table, a suggestion handwritten in pencil with a tiny arrow pointing to a better structure. Claire looked up, caught her daughter's eyes, and nodded once. No smile, no praise, just understanding. Sophie returned. The nod flipped to the next page in her lexicon and kept working. This was how they moved, like synchronized swimmers beneath a still surface perfectly attuned. There was no need to explain the stakes. Sophie knew. She always knew. Claire didn't have colleagues, mentors, or a support system behind her. She had an 8-year-old with an extraordinary mind and a quiet loyalty that had never wavered. In those early hours of the morning, they weren't mother and child, not exactly. They were teammates equals in a shared mission to turn endurance into proof, silence into victory. By the time Claire walked into Carter and Row 2 mornings later, she looked nothing like the woman who had first arrived weeks ago with cautious eyes and a second-hand bag. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her blazer pressed, but it was the steadiness in her posture that set the tone. She approached Daniel's office with the printed translations and a thumb drive in hand, placed them on his desk without ceremony, and said, "Completed all 3, annotated for tone and cultural nuance. Let me know if anything needs clarification." Daniel didn't smile immediately. He read the first few lines of the German press release, scanned the notes in the margin, and then glanced at her. "This is exceptional," he said simply with a quiet certainty that needed no embellishment. Claire nodded, offering no self-congratulations. She wasn't looking for praise, just recognition. That afternoon, during a team check-in, Amanda skimmed the documents on her tablet. She clicked through each page with increasing tightness around her jaw. When Daniel referenced Claire's work as the benchmark for future submissions, Amanda said nothing. No passive-aggressive remarks. No polite redirection. Just silence. And in that silence, Claire won. Not with volume or power, but with precision, endurance, and undeniable skill. It was the kind of victory that couldn't be challenged, only acknowledged. It was just after 10 on a Tuesday morning when Claire stepped out of the localization suite, rubbing the fatigue from her eyes after a long stretch of edits. The hallway was quiet, except for the distant murmur of a conference call echoing from a glass office. She turned the corner toward the main elevators, planning to grab a coffee before diving back into revisions. And then the doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped out. Gregory Shaw, the name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, the man who had vanished from her life like a footprint in water. He looked almost exactly the same, which made it worse. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, hair carefully styled, phone in hand, barking polite but clipped instructions to someone unseen. Claire froze. Her body didn't react right away. It was as if her mind had to catch up with the impossible image. Gregory, in this building. Her throat tightened. Her heart didn't race. It stopped. He hadn't seen her yet, not really, just glanced past her with the vague disinterest of someone accustomed to being watched, never watching. But Claire couldn't move. Her daughter's face flashed through her mind, Sophie, bright-eyed and resilient, carrying the name of a man who had chosen absence. And now here he was, striding through Carter and Row like he had built it. She knew in that moment this wasn't a coincidence. Gregory Shaw wasn't a relic of her past anymore. He had just stepped into her present. And everything was about to change. Within an hour, the internal announcement arrived. A crisp email from the executive office addressed to the Strategic Development Division and CC'd to all senior management. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Gregory Shaw as a strategic investor and advisory partner to Carter and Row Global. Mr. Shaw brings with him over a decade of experience in international acquisitions, multilingual market expansion, and cross-cultural negotiations. He will be working closely with our executive leadership and strategic planning teams to shape the company's long-term vision. Claire read it twice, the words blurring slightly. It wasn't just that he was back. It was that he now had power. Influence. A seat at the table where decisions were made. She sat motionless at her desk, the cursor on her screen, blinking in rhythm with the sudden throb at her temple. Of all companies, all cities, all lifelines, this is where he had landed. Or maybe he had known. Maybe this was intentional. She tried to breathe evenly as Amanda passed her desk and dropped a smug passing remark, big week for the firm. Guess we'll all have to impress Mr. Shaw. Claire didn't flinch. On the outside, she was composed. Inside, a storm gathered. The man who had once questioned her child's existence now had executive access to her workplace, her livelihood, her quiet. And unlike before, she wasn't powerless. Not anymore. But she also wasn't ready. Not yet. For the rest of the day, Claire moved like a shadow through the corridors of Carter and Row, hugging the edges of hallways, ducking into side rooms when she heard his voice approaching. It was instinctive, an old survival reflex that she thought she'd outgrown, but now returned with a cruel familiarity. Every time the elevator chimed or a door opened too quickly, her shoulders tensed, her breath shortened, and her body braced for impact. Her badge trembled slightly against her chest as she passed through security doors, praying she wouldn't have to cross paths with him again. But it wasn't just about avoidance. It was about containment. Inside her, a storm of panic brewed beneath the calm facade she had worked so hard to build. Her mind kept replaying his face, his posture, the effortless confidence in his stride, as if the past had never happened, as if Sophie had never happened. The injustice of his presence, so smooth, so unscathed, tightened like a vice around her ribs. Claire reminded herself to breathe, to stay small, to stay invisible. It was a cruel reversal. The woman who had finally stepped into her light now felt the urge to shrink again. She couldn't focus on her translation work. Sentences blurred, meaning drained from paragraphs, and her fingertips hovered uselessly over the keyboard. It was more than fear. It was a deep, spiraling disbelief that the man who had abandoned her in the most vulnerable moment of her life could now stroll through her world without consequence. And worse, that she might still break if he looked her in the eye. Sophie still didn't know. At 8 years old, she was brilliant in a dozen ways, fluent in 3 languages, emotionally perceptive beyond her years, and attuned to the smallest shifts in Claire's mood. But she had never asked about her father. Not directly. Over the years, Claire had carefully built a life that centered around presence, not absence. When Sophie was younger and began to notice other children with 2 parents at school events or family gatherings, she would ask quiet questions, simple ones like, "Was I always just with you, Mama? Or did I have a dad when I was a baby?" Claire had answered with honesty, but not with details. She had said, "You've always had me, and you are deeply loved." And somehow for Sophie that had been enough. But now, as Gregory Shaw walked the same halls, Claire worked in, breathing the same air, occupying the same spaces, that carefully constructed world felt suddenly fragile. Claire didn't know how to shield Sophie from a truth that was sharp-edged and deeply unfair. Gregory had never met his daughter. He didn't even know her name. And Claire had no idea what would happen if their paths ever crossed. Would he recognize her brilliance? Would he even care? Or worse, would he try to rewrite the past? Sophie still came home every afternoon with that bright, curious smile, her backpack bouncing, and her notebooks filled with ideas. She trusted the world her mother had created, believed in the shape of it, the safety of it. Claire watched her and felt a rising urgency in her chest because the one secret she had protected for 8 years was now walking straight toward them in a tailored suit and polished shoes. Claire entered the conference room with her notes clutched tightly in one hand, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. She had prepared meticulously for this presentation, cross-checked every data point, proofread every translated clause, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight that met her when she looked up. Gregory Shaw was already seated at the table directly across from the empty chair reserved for her. He looked relaxed, confident, like he belonged in this high-stakes room filled with executives and advisors. His suit was immaculate, his posture composed, and his eyes flicked toward her with the faintest trace of recognition, cool, unreadable, but unmistakable. Claire paused for just a heartbeat, then took her seat with quiet precision, refusing to let her hands tremble. Around them, the meeting unfolded. Slides clicked, strategy was discussed. Global partners mentioned, but Claire heard it all through a fog. Every word, every number felt distant, muted by the electric tension that crackled silently between her and the man who had once walked away from her and their unborn child without a backward glance. She didn't speak unless asked, but when she did, her voice was clear, her insight sharp. If Gregory noticed the strength behind her restraint, he said nothing. But his silence didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like calculation. The meeting ended with polite applause and the usual shuffling of documents, but Claire remained seated, gathering her notes, slowly trying to steady the trembling in her fingers. Most of the executives had filed out when she felt his presence still across from her, still seated, still watching. She looked up, and Gregory leaned forward slightly, his voice low, precise, and laced with a chill she remembered all too well. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, not with surprise, but with calculated disdain, let alone still existing in this world. His eyes didn't flicker, didn't search for softness, only control. Claire met his stare without flinching, her face unreadable, her spine locked in silent defiance. The words stung not because they questioned her capability, but because of their cruel familiarity. That tone, dismissive, surgical, was the same one he'd used the day he vanished from her life, the day he had erased her and their unborn child, with a single cold decision. He wasn't asking how she had survived. He was stating that she wasn't supposed to. And though his suit and title had changed, the man beneath remained the same, a polished absence masquerading as power. Claire didn't respond. She gathered her files, stood, and walked out because she owed him nothing, not even an answer. Within days of their tense encounter, a subtle but unmistakable shift rippled through the halls of Carter and Row. It began with whispers, half-formed thoughts exchanged near coffee machines, and quiet snickers behind cubicle walls. Claire noticed the change in how some colleagues greeted her, the way conversations paused when she entered a room, the thin smiles that no longer reached anyone's eyes. At first she tried to dismiss it as post-meeting politics, the usual fallout from high-profile presentations. But then she heard it clearly spoken by a junior associate who didn't realize she was within earshot. "They say she got her spot because her daughter impressed Daniel Carter, some kind of prodigy. Not her skills, just leverage." The words lodged in Claire's chest like a shard of glass. She knew exactly where it had come from. Gregory. No public confrontation, no accusations, just the slow, methodical seeding of doubt, the kind of undermining that corrodes quietly, efficiently. It was his signature move. Assassinate character with a smile, destroy confidence through implication. Claire had fought so hard to earn her place, not just for herself, but for Sophie, for the promise of a different life. And now the man who had once denied that child's very existence was using her name to discredit her mother. Claire said nothing, but inside something solidified. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was war, and she would not lose again. Claire said nothing. She walked the halls with her head high, her voice steady in meetings, her translations flawless and on time. To the outside world she was composed, professional, untouched by gossip. But inside, every step felt like treading a minefield of memory and rage. The lies Gregory had planted weren't just whispers, they were echoes of a deeper wound she had buried for years. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was containment. She couldn't afford to react, not here, not now. Not when every eye might be watching. Not when Sophie's future, her hard-earned place in this life, could be jeopardized by one misstep. But the injustice churned within her like fire under glass. Each glance, each half-smirk from colleagues who once welcomed her now felt like a test she had no choice but to pass. Claire wanted to scream that she had built this from scratch, that no one had handed her anything, that her daughter wasn't a pawn, but a miracle. But words were dangerous currency here, and she knew too well how quickly they could be twisted. So she swallowed the pain, clenched her jaw, and worked. Yet each hour she endured, each humiliation unchallenged, sharpened her resolve. She would not be erased. Not again. This time the silence was her armor, and it was holding for now. Daniel Carter had built a career on reading the room faster than anyone else. In board meetings, he could spot a lie beneath a compliment, detect resistance in a single breath. But what was unfolding around Claire Mitchell wasn't loud or obvious, it was quiet erosion. Still, Daniel noticed. He noticed how Amanda's tone toward Claire had sharpened ever so slightly, how team members who once praised her now deferred with rehearsed politeness. He noticed how Claire no longer lingered after meetings or made eye contact quite as long. And most of all, he noticed Gregory. The man was too smooth, too strategic, always 2 steps ahead with his charm and timing. Gregory never spoke ill of anyone directly, he didn't need to. His talent lay in raising questions, never accusations. "Are we sure she's experienced enough for international filings?" he once asked after Claire left a room. I heard her daughter's quite talented, he'd mused with a half smile. Daniel didn't respond, not yet. He watched, measured. There was no proof, only a pattern. And while he wasn't ready to intervene, something about it unsettled him. Claire had earned her place, that much he was sure of, but the air was changing and Daniel knew when a storm was coming. He just didn't know yet whose roof it would tear off first. Late that night, long after Sophie had fallen asleep with a book open on her chest, Claire sat alone at the small writing desk wedged beneath their apartment's only window. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets outside and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Her hands moved almost on their own as she unlocked the bottom drawer, the one she rarely opened anymore. Inside, beneath old tax files and utility bills, was a small linen envelope, its edges frayed, its paper curled slightly with age. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, her own handwriting, delicate and rushed. It was a letter she had written 8 years ago when Sophie was barely a week old, her tiny hands no bigger than Claire's thumb. She had written it on a sleepless night full of postpartum ache and impossible hope and sealed it with no address, no stamp, because deep down she knew she would never send it. Gregory, it began. She has your eyes. I don't know what to do with that. The letter spilled into raw pleas and fractured memories, how she wished he had stayed, how frightened she had been, how fiercely she had loved their child from the first breath. As Claire read her own words in the dim light, a deep sadness bloomed in her chest, not for herself, but for the girl she had been trying to reach, a man who had already decided not to listen. The letter, even after all these years, held no trace of bitterness. It wasn't a weapon or a cry for pity. It was simply a message from a young mother who hadn't yet learned how to be hard. Each sentence was carefully written as if she were afraid of saying too much, or worse, saying the wrong thing and pushing him further away. Claire hadn't begged Gregory to come back. She hadn't accused him or condemned him. Instead, she had written about the baby girl sleeping beside her on the hospital cot, swaddled in a blanket that was too big, with a tuft of dark hair and a birthmark near her shoulder that looked like a faded star. I named her Sophie, the letter read. She weighs 6 pounds and can already hold my finger like she's afraid I'll vanish. You probably won't read this, but I needed you to know she's here, not to ask anything from you, just so you can't say you didn't know. It was the quietest kind of courage, a refusal to let Sophie be invisible, even if her father had turned away. As Claire reread those lines now, her heart ached, not because she had been abandoned, but because she had once believed even for a moment that truth alone would be enough to change a man like Gregory. Claire didn't hear the soft footsteps behind her until it was too late. She turned instinctively, but Sophie was already standing by the doorframe, her hair tousled from sleep, eyes wide and unblinking. In her hand was the letter, thin, yellowed, fragile in her small fingers. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She must have left it on the desk while getting a glass of water just for a moment, but it had been enough. Sophie didn't say anything right away. She didn't cry or gasp. She simply looked at her mother with a seriousness that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face. "He didn't want me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words struck like thunder. Claire rushed to her, knelt down, tried to take the letter gently from her hand, but Sophie didn't let go. Her eyes were fixed on the truth she had just discovered, not through anger, but through the hollow realization that a piece of her story had been hidden. Claire wrapped her arms around her, trying to explain, to soften the blow, but no explanation could undo the silence of years. Sophie had read enough to understand one thing her father had known, and he had chosen to disappear anyway. Claire felt the question like a stone dropped into deep water, silent at first, but rippling through everything. Sophie's voice was small, uncertain, but far too steady for a child who had just discovered a father-shaped absence in her story. She looked up from the letter eyes, searching her mother's face, not just for answers, but for reassurance that her own worth hadn't just crumbled. "Mom," she asked slowly, "have you ever been chosen? I mean, did anyone ever choose you first?" The words hit Claire in a place so old and quiet, she didn't even know it still hurt. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out right away. No one had ever asked her that before, not with such painful clarity. Not even she had dared to phrase it like that. Claire swallowed, kneeling in front of her daughter, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "No," she whispered honestly, her voice thick. "But I chose you. Every single day. When no one else stood beside me, I chose to stay. For you. That's the choice that built everything we have." Sophie didn't cry, but her arms wrapped around Claire's neck tightly, fiercely, as if anchoring herself to the only thing that had never left. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. And sometimes the truth was enough. Claire held her daughter close, feeling the fragile weight of the question linger between them like mist. She didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know what to say, but because some truths were too sacred to rush. Sophie's small arms clung to her, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something quieter and deeper, a longing to understand why she had been left and why her mother had stayed. Claire didn't launch into an explanation about adult choices or broken men or how some people run when they should stay. None of that mattered right now. Instead, she pulled Sophie even closer, resting her chin gently on her daughter's head, letting silence say what words could not. And then in a voice low and sure, she spoke the only sentence that mattered: "I chose you, Sophie. And I have never, not once, regretted it." The words weren't dressed in poetry, but they rang with the quiet strength of a vow. Sophie didn't respond with words, only pressed her face into Claire's neck and let her tears soak silently into her mother's shirt. In that moment, Claire wasn't a woman who had been rejected or overlooked. She was everything solid and true in Sophie's world. And that finally was enough. Behind the polished walls of Carter and Row, rumors spread faster than memos. Gregory Shaw and Amanda Blake, though rarely seen together, had become an unspoken alliance, two sharp minds drawn together, not by trust but by shared ambition and a mutual threat named Claire Mitchell. It began subtly over coffee breaks and casual hallway exchanges, with Amanda sighing just a bit too loudly about unvetted hires and personal histories that don't align with company values. Gregory, ever the strategist, followed suit during project briefings, making offhand comments about the importance of moral integrity and leadership, and how some people bring emotional baggage into professional spaces. They never named Claire, never needed to. In an office that thrived on whispers and performance suggestion was enough. A phrase here, a raised eyebrow there. Soon Claire's name was being passed around, not in admiration, but in question. She kept her daughter's paternity a secret, someone murmured. What else might she be hiding, another added. The accusations weren't formal, but the implication was clear. Claire's presence was now framed as a liability, not a contribution. And though she continued to deliver flawless work, the air around her grew colder, heavier, tainted by the doubt Gregory and Amanda had so carefully seeded. The email arrived just after 9 o'clock. Short and sterile in tone, Claire Mitchell was requested to attend an internal ethics review the following morning. No explanation. No subject line beyond confidential personnel matter. She stared at the screen for several seconds, her stomach tightening. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Not after the strange looks in the hallway, not after the whispers that followed her into elevators. Claire closed her laptop slowly, swallowing the rising panic. In another room, Sophie was humming to herself over homework, blissfully unaware of the storm forming just outside their quiet life. At Carter and Row, the official line was clear: the ethics board protected integrity and impartiality. But Claire knew better. This wasn't about policy. It was about power. And Amanda Blake and Gregory Shaw were pulling every string. The hardest part wasn't the summons, it was Daniel's silence. He had said nothing, offered no guidance or protection. She didn't know if he believed the rumors or if he was simply unsure. Either way, it left her exposed. Claire sat back in her chair, exhaled through her nose, and reminded herself she had walked through worse. But still the question burned quietly inside her: would truth be enough this time? Or had they already decided what kind of woman she was? Claire sat in the stark, glass-paneled conference room, the silence around her louder than any accusation. 3 executives from the ethics committee stared at her with practiced neutrality, their pens poised, voices clipped. Gregory sat near the window, arms crossed, pretending disinterest, but watching every twitch of her hands. Amanda, seated beside him, had a folder open in front of her filled with documents Claire didn't need to read to know they were meant to discredit her. When asked if she had anything to say, Claire shook her head once, then folded her hands in her lap. There was no defiance in her silence, only fatigue, a quiet surrender that had settled into her bones after weeks of suspicion and whispered judgment. She had wanted to fight once, to explain, but now, with Sophie's safety still paramount in her mind, with the look of quiet cruelty in Gregory's eyes, she simply wanted out. If leaving meant her daughter could be left alone, if stepping aside meant the rumors would die, then maybe it was worth it. Claire inhaled slowly, eyes unfocused, and braced herself to say the words that would end it. "I understand if the company no longer sees me as fit to continue." But just before she spoke, the door behind her opened. The door creaked open with a soft, unexpected sound, and all eyes turned in unison. Standing just inside the doorway was Sophie, small, steady, and impossibly composed for an 8-year-old. In her hands, she held the yellowed letter, the one Claire had written to Gregory years ago, when Sophie had first been born. The sight of her there, framed by the cold light of the hallway, brought the entire room into an uneasy pause. Claire rose halfway from her seat, heart pounding. "Sophie, sweetheart." But her daughter stepped forward, her grip tight around the letter, her voice clear. "You forgot this," she said softly, but not weakly, looking directly at Gregory. "I think he should read it. All of it." The committee members shifted, uncertain how to respond to the child's presence, but no one moved to stop her. Gregory, visibly rattled, gave a slight shake of his head, but Sophie wasn't watching him anymore. She walked the few feet to the table and gently set the letter down in front of the lead reviewer, then turned to Amanda. "My mom didn't do anything wrong," she said. "She just didn't lie." For a moment, silence reigned. Claire's hands trembled, but she didn't speak. Her daughter had, and somehow it was enough to make the room feel heavier with truth. Sophie stood in the middle of the room, the letter trembling slightly in her small hands as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the faded words, and for a second, the silence in the room felt almost too thick to breathe through. But then she lifted her head, voice barely above a whisper, and said, "This is the truth my mom never sent. So, I'm going to read it for her." Claire tried to rise, lips parting to stop her, but Sophie gently shook her head and began to speak. Her voice wavered at first, soft with nerves, but with each word it grew steadier, pulled forward by something deeper than fear. "Dear Gregory," she read, "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. You have a daughter. Her name is Sophie. She was born with your eyes. She's healthy. She smiles when I sing. You may not want to be part of her life, and that's your choice. But I wanted to give you the chance to know she exists." Sophie paused, her voice catching. Then, through a deep breath, she looked up and added, not reading now, but speaking her own words. "She didn't send this letter because she didn't want to force herself into your world. But I'm in it now, and I deserve to be heard." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Amanda looked away. For a full minute, no one said a word. The air in the room felt suspended, like time itself was holding its breath. Sophie stood perfectly still, eyes wide but unblinking, her small hand still clutching the letter that had finally been spoken aloud. Claire sat, frozen, tears welling but unshed her chest, rising and falling in slow, careful rhythm, as if afraid even to exhale. Gregory shifted in his seat, his face pale, jaw clenched, but he said nothing. No defense, no denial. Amanda for once avoided eye contact, her posture no longer confident but coiled with discomfort. Then, in the thick, weighty quiet, a single sound broke through, the slow, deliberate clap of two hands. Daniel Carter stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable but his applause firm, echoing with quiet finality. 1 beat, 2, 3. Then others followed, first one executive, then another, until the entire room rose to their feet in a kind of wordless acknowledgement. Not just of Sophie's courage, but of the truth she had dared to carry where adults had failed. Claire, still seated, looked around with disbelief, emotion washing over her like a tide she hadn't seen coming. In that moment, her silence was no longer seen as weakness. It was grace. And Sophie had given it a voice. The following morning, in a full company assembly that gathered every department head and strategic member of Carter and Rowe, Daniel Carter stood before the polished mahogany podium with a poise that hushed the room. He looked neither angry nor triumphant, just calm, resolute. Behind him, the large screen bore only 2 words: clarification statement. Murmurs faded as he cleared his throat. Yesterday, this company witnessed something extraordinary, he began. Not a scandal, not an investigation, but truth spoken not by lawyers or leaders, but by an 8-year-old child who reminded us all what integrity sounds like when it's not dressed in self-interest. He paused, letting that settle. Claire Mitchell is not only a valued team member, but a woman who has acted with restraint, dignity, and quiet excellence in the face of provocation. Effective immediately, she will remain in her current post and be given expanded responsibilities within our Multilingual Initiatives division. Heads turned. A few clapped. Most were still stunned. But Daniel wasn't finished. As for Mr. Gregory Shaw, he said evenly, his conduct, both past and present, reflects a lack of alignment with the core ethics of this company. He will no longer serve on the Strategic Advisory Board, nor hold any decision-making capacity at Carter and Rowe. The silence that followed was thick but not uncertain. It was agreement. Daniel closed his notes and said, "We move forward with transparency and courage." And just like that, the tides turned. Not through spectacle, but through truth that refused to be buried, truth that this time had a voice. Amanda Blake sat stiffly at the long glass table in the executive conference room, her carefully curated expression of calm professionalism cracking ever so slightly at the corners. Daniel Carter, seated across from her with a closed folder in hand, didn't waste time on unnecessary small talk. His tone was measured, polite, but left no room for misinterpretation. Effective this week, he began, "Your role is being reassigned. You will be transitioning to a regional oversight position based in Charleston with a focus on internal compliance reviews." Amanda's lips tightened. She knew what that meant. It wasn't a promotion, it was exile in polite terms. Daniel continued, "Your tenure here has included valuable contributions, but recent behavior, particularly related to internal morale and fairness, has raised concerns. We've decided a different environment would be more conducive to the company's long-term integrity goals." She didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she saw in his eyes there would be no negotiation. Not this time. Daniel offered her a single nod, respectful but final. "We'll ensure a smooth transition. HR will be in touch by end of day." As Amanda gathered her things, she glanced briefly toward the window overlooking the city skyline. From this height, everything had once seemed within her grasp, but now the very walls she'd used to box others in had become her own. And as she walked out of that room, no applause followed, only the quiet realization that power built on pride rarely lasts. When Claire entered the boardroom that morning, she expected a follow-up debrief, perhaps a quiet acknowledgement of all that had happened. What she didn't expect was the sight of the entire multilingual team standing at attention, a printed letter of appointment sitting neatly on the table, and Daniel Carter gesturing for her to take the seat at the head. "Claire Mitchell," he said, voice steady and clear. "As of today, you are being officially appointed Director of Multilingual and Cultural Affairs for Carter and Rowe." Claire blinked, unable to hide the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "You've already been doing the work?" Daniel continued, not just through language, but through grace, resilience, and a commitment to truth that outlasted every whisper campaign thrown your way. "This appointment isn't a gesture, it's recognition long overdue." Around the room, quiet applause rippled as members of the team nodded in genuine support. Some smiled. One or two looked humbled, but Claire could barely hear them. All she could focus on was the name printed in bold on the letter, her name no longer footnoted by whispers of her past, no longer reduced to the label of cafe worker or single mother. She had earned this, not in spite of her journey, but because of it. And as she looked up, she saw Sophie just outside the glass, peeking in with wide, proud eyes. Claire smiled softly. She didn't need to speak. Her presence now had authority. And more importantly, it had voice. The office smelled of fresh paint and quiet beginnings. The nameplate on the door now read, "Claire Mitchell, Director etched in clean brass glinting faintly in the afternoon sun. Inside, boxes still lay unopened, the desk was only partially arranged, and the shelves stood empty waiting. Sophie entered quietly, the small heels of her school shoes tapping softly against the polished floor. In her hands she carried a single item wrapped carefully in a scarf, an old, weathered photograph of Claire in her waitress uniform arms, around a toddler-sized Sophie outside Maple Grove Cafe. Her mother's smile was soft, tired, but full back when they had almost nothing except each other. Without a word, Sophie walked over to the bookshelf nearest the window and placed the photograph on the center shelf, right where the sun could catch it every morning. Then she stepped back and looked at it, then at the room, then at her mother, who stood watching from the doorway. "You were all ready this before they gave you the title," Sophie said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a truth only children can state so plainly. Claire didn't respond. She just crossed the room and pulled Sophie into her arms. For a moment, the office wasn't a place of power or position. It was just home made out of the journey, the battles, the silences they had survived together. And now, with that picture standing like a quiet monument to where they came from, it was clear they hadn't just arrived. They had built this together. The idea took root one rainy afternoon as Daniel and Claire sat side by side in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, not as CEO and director, but as two people changed by a child's voice. The storm outside mirrored the journey behind them, complicated at times, overwhelming, but inside something entirely new was beginning. What if Claire began her fingers tracing the edge of a coffee mug? We created something that gave other children, especially those from underrepresented communities, the tools Sophie never had access to. Daniel looked at her intrigued. A language access program. More than that, Claire said, eyes lighting up. A platform where multilingual children are seen not as exceptions, but as assets. A place that nurtures translation, interpretation, cultural intelligence starting from early education. They sketched the vision that afternoon on a whiteboard cluttered with half-erased numbers. The Sophie Language Initiative, a non-profit arm of Carter and Rowe named in honor of the little girl who had bridged worlds with one quiet phone call. The program would fund language scholarships, provide community interpreters, and train students in linguistic equity. Daniel offered resources, connections, and infrastructure. Claire offered heart-lived experience and a curriculum drawn from every silent moment she and Sophie had endured. Over the next few weeks, what began as a conversation bloomed into policy. Contracts were signed. Pilot schools were selected across rural Kentucky and southern Ohio. The first scholarship recipient, a quiet boy from a refugee family, smiled when he heard the name. Sophie, he repeated like a promise. In that moment, Claire realized something powerful. Their past had not just been healed, it had become a seed. And from that seed, a new kind of language was growing. One made not of words, but of presence, dignity, and the radical belief that no child should ever feel invisible because of the way they speak. Claire never planned to become a philanthropist. In truth, she had spent most of her life stretching dollars, counting tips, and choosing between groceries and gas. But as the Sophie Language Initiative began gaining momentum, and as her role within Carter and Rowe stabilized with growing respect and visibility, something shifted in her. For the first time, she had access not just to stability, but to surplus, and she knew exactly what to do with it. With her first quarterly bonus as director, Claire didn't upgrade her car or take a vacation. Instead, she quietly contacted a local community center in Maple Grove, the same one where she had once taken shelter from a storm with Sophie as a toddler, and proposed a free evening language class. One class turned into two, Spanish on Tuesdays, German on Thursdays. Then came Vietnamese ASL and Arabic, each taught by local volunteers. Retired teachers, even former refugees who now saw a chance to give back. Claire didn't advertise her involvement. Her name wasn't on the door. But every folding chair, every donated textbook, every laminated worksheet bore the mark of someone who remembered what it felt like to be voiceless. When Carter and Rowe's profits grew under her leadership, Daniel proposed a formal grant pipeline to expand the effort, but Claire requested that the community arm remain simple, hyperlocal, accessible, and free of bureaucracy. "I'm not building an empire," she told him, "just planting places where kids can be heard." Word spread. Nearby towns asked to replicate the model. Former students returned to volunteer. Parents who spoke no English attended with their children and learned side by side. One night after class, a grandmother approached Claire and said, "This is the first time I've ever been spoken to in my own language in this country." Claire nodded, swallowing tears. That night, she drove home, not as a director, not even as a teacher, but as a woman who once waited tables, now using the dividends of dignity to rewrite the future. One word, one classroom, one open door at a time. At just 9 years old, Sophie Mitchell was already something of a quiet legend around the Maple Grove Community Center. She didn't walk into rooms with the loudness of authority, but with the calm assurance of someone who had always listened before she spoke. It started innocently enough, just her helping a younger girl pronounce Guten Morgen one morning before class, or correcting a boy's French accent with a gentle smile and a patient pause. But soon, the coordinators noticed. Sophie wasn't just bilingual, she was a natural teacher. She understood what the younger kids were afraid to say out loud, that language could feel like a wall if no one offered a door. So with Claire's blessing and a volunteer badge too large for her small hoodie, Sophie began running Sophie circles every Saturday morning. These were informal gatherings of kids aged 5 to 8 who were struggling with basic bilingual concepts. Sophie, kneeling beside them with flashcards she had made herself, made it feel less like school and more like a secret club. She used stories, songs, and even games she had translated from old books. Her rule was simple. We don't laugh when someone gets it wrong. We smile because they tried. And the kids listened. They didn't just listen, they flourished. A boy from El Salvador who had refused to speak in class whispered full sentences to her by week 3. A girl born to deaf parents started teaching ASL signs back to Sophie. Parents peeked in the doorway and found their children engaged, excited, confident in both their mother tongue and their second language. Sophie didn't see herself as extraordinary. In fact, she didn't really think about it at all. She just liked the way a child's eyes lit up when they realized they could say something in a new way and be understood. She liked how the room filled with laughter, with courage, with belonging. Claire would sometimes watch from the hallway, her arms folded and her heart swelling with something she didn't have a name for, but knew was real. Her daughter wasn't just bridging words, she was building a world where every voice mattered. The town hall was packed that Thursday evening, its modest stage decorated with paper flags and handmade posters drawn by local schoolchildren. The mayor of Maple Grove, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a worn clipboard, stepped up to the microphone and cleared her throat with a proud smile. "Tonight," she began, "we recognize not just achievement, but heart courage and small everyday actions that quietly transform lives." There was a murmur in the audience as Sophie Mitchell's name was called. At just 10 years old, Sophie stood from her front row seat in a second-hand blue dress and walked to the stage with the grace of someone far older, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Her mother Claire watched from the crowd, holding back tears that threatened to spill. The mayor recited Sophie's accomplishments, how she had helped more than 20 children gain confidence in speaking 2 languages, how she had created her own materials, how she'd volunteered every Saturday without fail for over a year. But more than that, the mayor added, looking directly at Sophie, she taught kindness without saying the word. She made space for others without needing recognition. And that, she said as she handed Sophie a plaque nearly as big as her chest, is what leadership looks like. The crowd stood in ovation. Neighbors, students, even skeptical business leaders who had once questioned Claire's place in the company. That night, as Sophie held her plaque in both hands and gave a small, quiet bow, the town didn't just see a child, they saw a legacy in motion. And Claire, heart full, whispered to herself, "She's becoming everything I once hoped to be." After the ceremony, as townspeople mingled and children posed for photos with cupcakes and handmade certificates, a small group of local reporters gathered near the base of the stage. One of them, a young woman with a notepad and camera slung around her neck, approached Claire and Sophie gently, her tone polite but curious. "Sophie, congratulations," she said, crouching to meet the girl's eye level. "We'd love to ask just one question for the town newsletter, if that's okay." Sophie glanced at Claire, who nodded with a soft smile, then turned back toward the reporter. "Your name has become quite known around Maple Grove these days," the reporter continued. "Sophie Mitchell. A lot of people are wondering, does your name have a special meaning?" Sophie blinked thoughtful, then looked up at her mother. Claire's heart caught for a second. Sophie took a breath. "Sophie means wisdom," she said quietly. "That's what my mom told me." Then she added, "Mitchell is her last name. She gave it to me because it's the name of the person who stayed." There was a pause, a brief, beautiful silence where even the clicking of the camera stopped. Claire's eyes welled, but she didn't speak. She let her daughter's words carry the truth. The reporter, visibly moved, scribbled something quickly on her notepad. That's powerful," she whispered. Sophie shrugged a little. "It's just what's real." In that moment, beneath a banner that read, "Community begins with care," the crowd didn't just see a child prodigy or a local hero. They saw a family that had weathered silence and shame and turned it into strength. They saw love, quiet, steady, and chosen. The reporter, still kneeling, seemed almost reluctant to end the interview. Her voice softened, hesitating as if sensing there was something deeper beneath Sophie's calm exterior. "If I may," she asked gently, "have you ever thought about taking your father's last name?" Around them, the crowd had quieted again, drawn to the exchange not by spectacle, but by something more intimate truth. Sophie stood a little taller, not defensive, just grounded. She looked out at the audience, then at Claire, and finally back at the reporter with a gaze steady beyond her years. "No," she said clearly, "that name doesn't belong to me." The reporter blinked, surprised, but before she could ask more, Sophie continued, her voice unwavering. "Mitchell is my mother's name. She's the one who first said my name out loud, not in fear, not to erase me, but with hope. She was the first to say it like it mattered." The weight of her words settled over the small crowd like mist, soft and unshakable. "She gave me a name that meant I existed." Sophie added, her hands folded in front of her. "Not because of blood, but because she chose to see me, to raise me, to stay. And that's the name I carry. Forever." Claire turned away briefly, overcome, tears silently falling onto her blouse, but Sophie didn't waver. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply sure. The reporter moved beyond words, simply nodded. Cameras flashed once, twice, then stopped, as if the moment deserved stillness, not noise. In a world obsessed with legacy and lineage, Sophie Mitchell had quietly rewritten both, not by fighting for a name, but by honoring the one that had honored her first. Claire stood at the very edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most, her figure half shadowed by the low branches of an old maple tree that marked the edge of the town square. The early evening sun cast golden light across the lawn where the ceremony had just concluded, and applause still echoed faintly in the air like the last ripples on water. But Claire heard none of it. Her eyes were fixed on Sophie, standing proud and composed on that small wooden stage, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, her voice echoing with clarity and strength. As Sophie spoke the words, "She gave me a name that meant I existed," something inside Claire splintered, not in pain, but in overwhelming, aching love. The first tear rolled down her cheek before she could stop it, followed by another and another, until her vision blurred and the world softened into watercolor. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, let herself feel everything: the fear of raising a child alone, the years of quiet sacrifice, the nights spent praying Sophie wouldn't one day feel like a mistake. But here she was, Sophie Mitchell, not just standing, but choosing her. With all the world watching, Sophie had told the truth that mattered most, not about blood or status or history, but about being seen, named, and loved. Claire brought her hand to her chest as the crowd erupted again in applause. No one looked her way, but that didn't matter. Her daughter had seen her. Her daughter had chosen her. And in that still golden moment, Claire Mitchell, once a scared waitress in a town too small to hold her dreams, finally let herself believe she had done something right. In real life, many people carry the weight of names they didn't choose, names that remind them of abandonment, betrayal, or silence. But just like Sophie Mitchell, we have the quiet power to reclaim identity, not through confrontation, but through intention. Sophie kept her mother's name, not because it was the loudest, but because it was spoken with love. This story reminds us that family is not always defined by blood, but by the people who show up, stay, and choose us every day. Whether you're a parent raising a child alone, a child searching for belonging, or someone rebuilding after being cast aside, remember this. Your worth isn't tied to who walked away. It's proven by who stayed, who believed in you, and who called your name with hope. Never underestimate the impact of small, steady presence. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be real. So if this story touched something in you, maybe reminded you of your own name, your own journey, or someone who gave you the strength to keep going, share it with them. Or tell us in the comments, what name do you carry and what does it mean to you? Don't forget to save this story so you can come back to it on hard days, and subscribe for more powerful, heart-driven stories like this. Your story matters, and someone out there might need to hear it too.